Anyway, we talk a lot about what Keat wears. This is a That Chapter podcast, by the way. Welcome. We talk a lot about what Keat wears on the podcast, but today I thought I'd talk about
me.
What I wear. Yeah, I thought I'd talk about me, Misha, and what I'm wearing. Today I'm wearing a red, this is a real Korean Marines t-shirt.
Yeah, because I never see you in red.
I know, I'm not a guy who wears red, only black is my wardrobe. But today, so this is an actual Korean Marines. It was given to me, it was a gift.
Okay.
From a friend who's, the Korean Marines are like apparently like shit hot.
Mm-hmm. What is it, a baseball team?
No, it's the actual Marines.
Oh, the Marines.
The Marines. What do you think I was saying?
I don't know. I just I knew you went to a lot
Marines,
of baseball.
what does that mean? Yeah.
I knew you went to a lot of baseball games. Then.
No. The military guys. Right. Yeah. But so it kind of got me thinking. Now that I'm wearing this, and it has his name on the back of it too. It's in Korean. So
that's a terrible uniform. First of all, it's red.
Yeah.
Then have the name on it.
Spotted easily, especially in order. But it got me thinking about what I want my new hobby to be.
Okay.
Stolen valor. I think I'm just going to start wearing military gear and go around to stores and restaurants and just see what I can get away with.
And night, get some discounts.
Maybe you get some, go to McDonald's. Yeah. 10%. Hey, yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Sir, yes, sir. Give me a discount, please.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be great?
That sounds fantastic.
I think I might start stolen valor just for the crack. Just to see what's going to happen.
See what happens.
And then if somebody, comes ask me and starts trying to call me out, I'll be like, sir, yes, I'm Army Marines, yes, top classified. What I did was classified. It's on a need-to-know basis. What you do need to know is I've killed 50 people. Would you like to make it 51? 50 confirmed kills.
That would actually be even better. Instead of your name on the back, just a list of names of people that you've killed. That'd be more terrifying.
That is good. Yeah, like notches on a bedpost. That's great.
Cool, yeah.
So anyway, that's what I was just doing, a little thinking about, my beautiful mind. I might take up stolen valor-ing.
Let's see how that goes. Let's see how it plays out.
Yeah, why not, right? What's the worst that could happen, right? It'll be funny.
And then to no one's surprise, Mike was found dead in an alley.
It seems like one of those skits that should be on Jackass. They do old people valor and like disabled people valor, blind and the people in wheelchairs pushing down broken legs. So you're like, I'm Steve-O, and this is stolen valoring. You can do something like that.
How much worse could it get?
This feels like it should be a reality TV show.
Do you know who'd really appreciate that?
Who's that?
Veterans.
Well, this is about what I'd love. What I think is funny.
Not talk about them.
I think it'd be hilarious. But anyways, there you go, folks. That's just the kind of stuff I've been thinking about. During the day, I just walk around thinking my funny little thoughts.
Speaking of funny thoughts, I came across this. So it's a bit of an old story, but I think it's really, really fucking funny.
Okay.
So I thought I'd tell you.
Okay.
Have you heard of the Hitchbot?
No.
Okay. So the Hitchbot, it's this kid-sized robot, and it was designed as a social experiment to explore human-robot interactions. It relied entirely on the kindness of strangers for transportation. It looked like a robot with it had arms and legs, but the arms and legs didn't do anything, so it needed to be picked up and moved around. But it was equipped with GPS and a camera, and it had speech capabilities as well. So that was the Hitchbot. The whole idea of it was to hitchhike across different countries.
Okay.
So it successfully travelled across Canada and Germany and then the Netherlands without any incident at all.
I guarantee you some people probably tried to fuck that machine, that robot. Okay. That definitely happened.
It was sticky after a while.
Netherlands,
big
Germany,
smile on his
face.
On. But then it got to the US and it was vandalized beyond repair in Philadelphia.
Well, that's Philly, so that's not surprising at all.
It was the funniest thing ever. It made it across all these countries, and then as soon as
it gets, I'll get vandalized if I go to Philadelphia.
Yeah.
Have you ever been to Philly?
No, I haven't.
I've been before. No. There's nice parts to it, but it can get woof.
It would make sense why a robot would get destroyed.
Yeah, I think I told you about the time I went to an Eagles game in Philadelphia. And obviously, anybody who's even watched It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia knows you don't mess around with the Eagles fans.
Oh, yeah.
And so this was, probably 15 years ago, maybe 12 years ago.
Yeah.
And it was the Eagles versus the Cowboys. Cowboys are, a hated rival.
Yep.
Eagles lost. It was a shit game. It was 12-9, only field goals. Yeah. It was during Tony Romo was playing, and Nick Foles, first round Nick Foles, before he won the Super Bowl. So anyway, we were leaving the game. everybody is so fucking angry. And the Eagles fans are terrifying
Yeah,
when they lose. They're absolutely scared. Like, they're going to destroying shit, pushing shit, but not like in a celebratory way, destroying shit, in a pissed off, don't even look them in the eye or else.
Okay.
Then we got onto the subway and they started accusing other Eagles fans of being spies and traitors, of being secret Cowboys fans. I've never seen that before. They were fighting each other.
That's great.
Accusing them of being like undercover Dallas fans.
That's so funny.
That's Philly for you.
Meanwhile, you were standing in the middle in your army uniform.
In my army uniform, yeah, exactly. And everybody respected me.
Thank you for your service.
Yeah.
You're welcome, guys. You're welcome.
All right. So I think without further ado, shall we get into today's story, Keith?
Yeah, let's get into it.
I think we should. Today, folks, we are talking about the story of the servant girl Annihilator. This is a good one. I do like these old-timey, spooky mysteries.
The old-timey crimies.
Yeah, the old-timey crimies. This is a good one. And it takes us all the way back to the mid-1800s to Texas. Today, the Central East neighborhood of Austin, Texas is known as East Cesar Chavez. However, it wasn't always known as so. Back in the day, it was called Masontown, one of Austin, Texas's oldest neighborhoods, lying on the northern bank of the Colorado River in Travis County. Little of what was Masontown, or Masonville, actually remains today.
Do you know it was only changed to name to East Cesar Chavez in 1999?
In 1999? Really? From Masonville? Wow. It just seems like it was changed like that decades and decades ago.
Right? Yeah, that's what I thought.
Which I suppose technically is decades and decades ago now.
Oh, yeah, I don't like that.
Let's move on swiftly. So instead, the modern East Cesar Chavez area is made up mainly of residential buildings built throughout the 20th century. The population is largely Hispanic and working class. It's also relatively densely populated compared to many other parts of Texas, with a population of 3,819 as of the 2009 census, which is probably fairly out of date by this stage. Those 4,000 people, who make up just that area today, would have made up 80% of the population of Austin as a whole, the entire city, back in 1865. So, wasn't a whole lot of people back in Austin, Texas to when we're going. Back in the 1880s, Masontown was a very different place. In those days, as the frontier finally died and the era of the Old West faded, the population was mainly African American. The area having been settled by freed slaves following the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, and then the land was bought by brothers Sam and Rayford Mason in 1867, following the end of the American Civil War. Henceforth, it became known as Masontown or Masonville, depending on who you're asking. In the space of 20 years, between 1865 and 1885, the population of Austin exploded from under 5,000 permanent residents to almost 20,000, though that number was somewhat reduced, as we will get into. Now, let's get straight to the murder.
It is.
It all started. The first of the 8 total victims normally attributed to the servant girl killer came on New Year's Eve, 1884. A young black cook named Molly Smith, who was around 25 years old at the time, was in her lodgings, in bed with her boyfriend, Walter, when she was struck in the head with the blunt side of an axe. The first blow, though, wasn't enough to kill, just to subdue her as she was dragged out into the yard, where she was brutally raped and then killed by multiple blows from the killer's axe. Smith was found lying in a puddle of her own blood in the snow, and had a frenzy of deep incisions and lacerations to her chest, legs, stomach, and arms. It was absolutely brutal. Her boyfriend, 30-year-old Walter Smith, was knocked unconscious during the attack and was ultimately spared. He knew nothing of the killer, couldn't remember a thing of the attack. It was actually interesting, Walter was found first, and people believed that Molly had attacked him, as she was known to have a temper. They didn't know where she was, so they assumed she had fled after attacking her boyfriend in the middle of the night. It was then the very next morning, her body was found out in the yard, torn to shreds.
You know, Walter, he was actually considered a suspect at one point. But, like aside from the obvious, like the fact that he'd clearly been attacked too, with gashes on his head and a big swollen face, there were a few other things that didn't quite add up. So for one, the axe used in the murder, it didn't belong to him or anyone else in the house. Now, it's possible the weapon was stolen, but if that was the case, it would suggest that there was premeditation. And by all accounts, even though she had a bit of a temper on her, the couple, they got on well. So it would have been a crime of passion then, and that kind of rules out the whole planning part of it.
Right.
The doctor who examined Walter's wounds, he also believed that they weren't caused by an axe, but a rod of iron or steel. So investigators, they never found such an object when they were investigating the crime scene. And it wouldn't make sense for Walter to hide the weapon used to injure himself, but then leave the actual murder weapon out in the open for everyone else to find.
Mm-hmm.
They also discovered a trail of footprints in the snow leading away from the house towards Shoal Creek. So Molly's murder took place just a block west of the creek, a location right in the heart of the killer's suspected territory. And several of the other attacks were also clustered around the area, which led both early investigators and modern researchers to believe that the murder may have been a local. I think it's safe to say that Walter didn't do it, but it was definitely somebody else was afoot.
Well, definitely, as we will get into. Another black cook and mother of 3 children, 30-year-old Eliza Shelley, was attacked next. This was on May 7th, 1885, and she was killed outside of 302 East Cypress Street, where she had a room. Much like the first victim, Molly Smith, Eliza was dragged from her bed, then sexually assaulted and fatally attacked with an axe. In what would become another trademark of the killer, in both cases, the axe that had been used was dropped a few feet away from the body. The attack on Shelley was as brutal, if not even more so, than the first attack on Molly Smith. Her butchered body was discovered on the floor of her bedroom by her young children. Shelley had been left with her head almost cut in 2 pieces. The third suspected victim, a 33-year-old woman named Irene Cross, was killed roughly 2 weeks later, on May 23rd, 1885, in an outbuilding where she was sleeping when she was attacked. Only this time, the tool used was a knife. Unlike the first 2 victims, Cross wasn't moved from her bed and clung to life slightly longer, but ultimately succumbed to the severe wounds. Cross had lingered long enough to even speak to a reporter. Though the crime had several differences, it also had a lot of similarities, including taking place close to midnight and on the night of a bright moon. The killer had cut and stabbed Cross so many times, she appeared to have been almost scalped.
Jesus, that's
Yeah.
messed up. It was around this time that the killer got the nickname, the Servant Girl Annihilator. So this was thanks to the author O. Henry. His real name was William Sidney Porter, and he lived in Austin's Masontown neighborhood. But in a letter dated May 1885, just after the brutal murder of Irene Cross, he wrote to a friend, explaining that Masontown was, and this is a quote, fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids of the Servant Girl Annihilator, who makes things lively during the dead hours of the night.
I love that. Sure,
Right?
we're having a good time, you know? It's great. Sure, it's pretty
Keeps
fucking
interesting.
boring around here, but at least there's somebody going around butchering the servants, so it's great.
Now, I guess with dark humor aside, the quote, it not only gives the killer his nickname, but also indicates that locals had not yet identified a single likely suspect.
Yeah. They were just like scratching their heads. It was just people getting attacked, and we've tried nothing, and we don't know where to go, you know? The next victim, however, drew far more attention than the first 3 victims. Given the social and political climate for people of color in the United States in the late 1800s, the first 3 victims of the newly christened Annihilator were poor, young black women. Basically, on the 1800s social ladder, they were considered beneath the floorboards the ladder was standing on. So, it's no great surprise that the newspapers didn't take too much interest into the killings, regardless of how brutal they were. The latest victim apparently crossed that line, though, as she was considered just young enough and just white enough to warrant attention. The murder of 11-year-old Mary Ramey, a mixed-race girl, on August 30th, 1885 was especially cruel. As with the first 2 victims, Ramey was dragged from her bed in her room. Mary's mother, 50-year-old Rebecca, was also attacked, but would make a full recovery. The 2 had been asleep in the same bed when the killer struck. After rendering Rebecca unconscious, the murderer took the 11-year-old to an outside wash house, where she was savagely sexually assaulted before being finished off by being stabbed through the ear with a metal rod.
Jesus.
Damn. Young Mary was the first victim who wasn't a servant, yet the name had already caught on by this stage. On September 28, 1885, a month on from the attack on the Rameys, and with public attention around the servant girl murders case growing, 20-year-old Gracie Vance and her partner, 25-year-old Orange Washington, became the 5th and 6th victims of the fatal assault by the Annihilator. The young couple were both bludgeoned to death. Gracie apparently bore the brunt of the killer's rage. A contemporary article in the Austin Daily Statesman described the bloody scene and Gracie as being, quote, almost beaten to a jelly. Washington was killed first, attacked as he slept next to Gracie. Gracie was then beaten before being dragged outside into the yard, assaulted, and then killed in line with the killer's usual MO. Vance and Washington were killed in the servants' quarters, once again on a brightly moonlit night.
Interestingly, on the night of the attack, the couple, they had 2 house guests over, Lucinda Body and Patsy Gibson. And they were also both attacked while they were all staying in the same room. But they would ultimately survive. So it seems that while Gracie, Lucinda, Patsy and Orange had been sleeping, the killer climbed in through the open window and beat all 4 of them unconscious. Gracie was then thrown from the window, tossed over a fence and dragged through the weeds behind the stables. There, she must have regained consciousness because there was signs of a struggle, but it was obviously a struggle that Gracie lost. She was raped and beaten with a brick until she was dead. Even though this attack had been the most daring and violent, what was most shocking, for the newspapers at least, was that this happened on one of the more well-off streets in Masonville. So naturally the press were far more interested in it compared to when the killings were limited to, the poorer streets.
Yeah, it's crazy though the killer would go into a place where there's 4 people, like the same room where there's 4, but that's like...
Quite an escalation.
Man, that's wild. It just makes me think of the Idaho killings, in those college kids,
yes.
the 4 college kids who were murdered.
Yeah.
That's always the scariest to me, is when a killer goes into a house or a place where there's multiple people and kills them all.
Has complete control.
Yeah, it's like you think like there's one person, okay, maybe 2, but 4 people in one room, and he was like, "Yep, this'll do."
Yeah.
That's terrifying. That's honestly the
scary.
scariest killers. That actually makes me like
no fear, like
chills, baby, chills. So next was 41-year-old Susan Hancock, and she was the Annihilator's canonical victim number 8, claimed almost 3 months after the murders of Vance and Washington. This was on Christmas Eve, 1885. Susan was not a servant girl and was attacked in the home she shared with her husband, 55-year-old carpenter Moses H. Hancock, and her daughters, 15-year-old Lena and 10-year-old Ida, all of whom were in the family home at 203 East Water Street when the attack took place. It was in the late hours of the night and Santa Claus was on his way. Suddenly there was a screaming. A woman had been chopped to pieces. Word was running down the street. It was Mrs. Hancock, and she was still breathing when the authorities found her. See, Susan didn't sleep in the same bedroom as her husband Moses. So, when Moses heard some strange noises in the middle of the night, he walked into his wife's bedroom, and saw the bedsheet over the floor, covered in blood. The window was open as the cool breeze blew in, and Moses saw blood beside the window. He then ran down to the yard where the window led to, and he saw a man wearing dark clothing fleeing into the night. Moses actually grabbed a brick and threw it after him, then ran down to his wife's aid as she lay there in the yard also, and she soon passed away. Susan Hancock's autopsy took place just hours after her murder. Her time of death was placed around 9 o'clock, with her autopsy taking place at 11:30. She'd suffered several horrific injuries, including a blow to the left side of her head that had cut through the top of Susan's ear, through the flesh and into her skull. A second strike to the left side of her forehead and impacting about an inch above her eye, cut through the flesh and caused a 3-inch long break in her skull beneath the cut. The tool used was heavy enough, and the force of the blow so strong that it had driven the broken shards of bone into Susan's brain. The break caused by these 2 blows ran into one another, causing one long hole in Susan's head. A third wound to the right side of her head had cut into the ear canal, through the skull, and another 2 inches into Susan's brain. Each of the head wounds were enough to cause death by themselves, and they were all consistent with a small axe or hatchet. But yet again, we have another victim, and he consistently does this. He breaks into a house, finds a female, usually, and he attacks them in the bed, but then he drags them outside. Like he just did with Susan. Dragged her from her bedroom, like out the window into the yard. It's like crazy. That's so much, the risk of you getting caught. Like, why would you feel the need to remove them from the house into an outdoor area? That's
true.
what's so strange about this. Like,
it's like
if you're going to kill them, why not just kill them in the room where there's, there's less chance of being caught, screams being heard, commotion, passersby, yada, yada, yada.
It's like you wanted time with themselves. Just wanted to control that person.
Yeah. It's really bizarre. Described as beautiful and frail, 17-year-old Eula Phillips, a young wife to 23-year-old musician James Phillips, and mother of a 1-year-old son named Thomas, was next to die at the hands of the Annihilator. This was on December 24th, 1885, Christmas Eve. And yes, that was 2 victims attributed to the killer on the very same day. 17-year-old Eula, known as Luli to her closest friends, was killed roughly an hour after Susan Hancock. Thanks to her status in society, Eula's death hit the headlines far harder than those before hers, including Susan Hancock's. Eula was descended from some very prominent people in Texas. Her grandfather was a member of Stephen F. Austin's original colony that gave the city its very name. Eula was found dead at the end of a bloody trail on the suburb's wealthiest street, at the site of where the city's public library stands today. The killer had used 2 large, heavy pieces of wood to pin Eula down during the subsequent attack. Her small, nude body was left in the dark alleyway behind her father-in-law's house, where she lived with her husband, Jimmy.
One article described the attack on Eula as murderous, diabolical, and hellish. Eula was described as still having a look of agony on her face, despite being dead for some time. James Phillips, her husband, he was found still in the couple's bed, and their son was unharmed next to him. He was just there eating an apple.
Yeah.
James was like semi-conscious, having been hit in the back of the head, and the sadistic killer had now crossed the lines of class and race. So he didn't discriminate.
Yeah, but I mean, you got to give him that.
Yeah, right.
I'll give him that, right? So
Take the little wins.
yeah. So the uproar was quick. Patrols of volunteer groups were arranged. The Austin Police Department went on a hiring spree. People left candles burning all night. Soon rumors of the killer being supernatural began. He only attacked on bright moonlit nights. And you say werewolf?
Right?
Ooh, I can. There was talk of mobs and street justice. Authorities knew they needed to keep the peace. The city marshal feared that the potential of lynchings was not out of the question if someone didn't get a handle on things quick. They also knew that meant getting someone behind bars. The very next day, Christmas Day, several important people from around Austin, including members of the clergy, politicians, and law enforcement, met to try and come up with a way to stem the slayings. Governor John Ireland even suggested that should another attack occur, a fire alarm should be set off to get attention faster, not allow the killer to escape the area. Confidence in the city's young and inexperienced police chief, Grooms Lee, had plummeted from an already low starting point.
Yeah, just like a year earlier, he'd been torn apart by some of Austin's top men who were furious over reports that most of the city's cops were spending a lot of their time investigating saloons and brothels.
My kind of cops.
Right? Instead of actually policing the streets, which they should be doing. It got messy enough that Lee almost faced impeachment, but he managed to dodge that stain on his record, likely thanks to his father, who was a well-connected local politician. But now with 2 white women being murdered, the outrage was back, and louder than ever before. It was the perfect storm for the I told you so crowd, who had been waiting for some time to, prove their point.
Man, imagine being a cop back in like the 1800s. It would rock. You could just do nothing all day. Do you ever, the movie Gangs of New York, where, what's his name? What's the actor's name? John C. Reilly.
Oh, yeah.
So he plays a cop in that. He's like, oh, jeez, it's funny. I'm the cop. And he's great. He's like an Irish, because because all the cops are Irish back then. Yeah. And he's, oh, jeez, I'm just coming around for my money. Man, how great would it be? You could just like extort people. Yeah. They're original gangsters. I mean, that's essentially what the cops actually started out as. They were the government's gangsters. They would just extort people. It's like, you don't want your store to get destroyed.
Yep.
Money.
Money now.
Yeah,
give me money.
I guess that's why so many of the cops back then were Irish. We knew how to have a good time.
Exactly. Yeah. We're beating the fuck out of people and getting drunk all the time and getting paid for it. It's great. So in the cases of both Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips, each of the women's respective husbands were arrested and charged with their wives' murders. This took place against the backdrop of headlines like Blood, Blood, Blood and Austin's Bloody Murders. That first headline, by the way, Blood, 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 that was in The Statesman, and it was followed by the subheading of The Demons Have Transferred Their Thirst for Blood to White People.
Ugh.
Yeah, that's, yikes! Big yikes! Ooh, yeah, that's pretty bad.
Yep.
Both men were pulled in, despite the wider opinion between the police and public being that the crimes were all committed by the same killer. Even most, wide opinion was that the husbands probably didn't do it, but they weren't looking at all those other, poor women who had been brutally murdered. They're just looking at these 2. Looking back, especially considering Eula Phillips was also struck in the head, it does seem that the men were, well, they were used as scapegoats to stop unrest from getting out of hand. Naturally, it was in the poor, black community of Masontown that unrest was felt the hardest. Almost 400 men, nearly all black, were brought in and looked as potentially being the servant girl killer. And yeah, the name struck regardless of the victim's actual status. The governor offered a $300 reward, and a committee of private businessmen with interests in the area offered a $3,000 reward. That was life-changing money back then. There was no fingerprinting, no blood analysis. Anything resembling modern forensics was 100 years off the horizon. The only solid piece of evidence that the police were able to collect was a bloody footprint, made seemingly by a man walking barefoot across the scene. The print had been left on Eula Phillips's porch.
To preserve the evidence, they cut out and lifted the floorboard. Normally a footprint wouldn't be anything special, but this one was different. It was, as you said, it was barefoot. And it looked like the killer had been missing a toe. Now, this wasn't exactly the smoking gun that they were hoping for. Maybe the toe just hadn't been pressed down that day enough. Maybe there was like a quirk or a deformity. Or maybe that little piggy really did go down the market.
Hey.
Who knows?
It's a mystery. That's good. So in desperation, Mayor Robertson called on private detectives from Houston's Noble Detective Agency to reinforce Police Chief Lee's local officers. The pressure clearly got to Police Chief Lee, and he was quick to try and shift it to the men of the black community. One particularly dark incident involved Lee and several of his men entering one of the most popular black saloons, the Black Elephant, where they accosted a local man named Alex Mack. The Black Elephant was located on Pekin Street, a street of mostly white-owned businesses, which shows how relaxed relations between the races usually were in the area and Austin as a whole, at least compared to a lot of other southern states back at this time. So that should just tell you how fraught the murders had gotten on people's nerves, none more so than Lee, who, having taken Alex Mack into custody, had his men drag him outside where they began to beat him and demand he tell them what he knew about the murders. When Alex Mack insisted he knew nothing, Lee had his men put a noose around his neck. If $3,300 wasn't enough to get Mack to admit what he knew, it's fair to say he didn't know anything, and it's doubtful any amount of kicking and punching would change that, or threats of lynching.
Luckily for Mack, there was a white man named Press Hopkins, and he was watching the whole thing unfold from his window across the street, and he said himself, "Nope, not in my watch." So armed with just a jumbo set of cojones, Hopkins, he confronted Lee and the others and demanded that they let Mack go. And amazingly, they did. So now, with no solid leads and not much else to work with, the authorities were left hoping the killer might just slip up again and, give him another shot, give him another go at it. But for the locals at this point, they were left just as scared of the authorities as they were of the killer lurking in the dark.
Absolutely. So with the area of Masontown fast becoming a dangerous place to be, the authorities, they needed someone in cuffs to calm things down. Hence, they went for the husbands. James Phillips was first to feel the long arm of the law around his shoulder in early January 1886. A few weeks later, he was joined by 55-year-old Moses Hancock. The Statesman, the newspaper, was pretty quick to point out the unlikelihood that the two men had come up with the same plan on the same evening, completely independent of one another. As I said just before, when the husbands were arrested, a lot of people didn't buy it, that they killed their wives in the exact same way, on the exact same night, and didn't kill like the other 8 people or however other many people had been killed at this stage. It just didn't seem like the husbands had done it. The district attorney, James H. Robertson, had recently lost a high-profile case and was desperate for a win to put these two men behind bars for life. With that, and the climate around the Annihilator in his mind, he went in with everything he had, and was a little more than overzealous. The DA used a letter Susan had written her husband just before her death as a motive in the Hancock case. In the letter, Susan had said that though she loved him, she could no longer live with his drinking. The DA alleged that Moses had spent the night of the murder drinking in the Iron Front Saloon and had grown enraged at his wife, leading him to go home and kill her. It's pretty thin to say the least.
Yeah, it's pretty flimsy.
Yeah.
It's not like the letter is like, I hate when you drink, and your massive axe collection.
Yeah. Much like Moses Hancock, James Jimmy Phillips was also known to be a drinker and apparently abusive of his young wife, Eula. There were plenty who thought Jimmy was perfectly capable of murdering his wife. Eula would have to stay with her big sister Alma after one of Jimmy's particularly bad drinking spells. Jimmy's sister, Delia, would even testify that she had once seen Jimmy chase her around with a knife. They were terrified and had to run out of the house to escape him. During the course of James Phillips' trial, it was also revealed that Eula had been known to frequent a house belonging to a May Tobin. It was a, quote, house of assignation. She had been visiting there in the run-up to her death. A house of assignation, by the way, that just means brothel. That's basically it. The hotel on Congress Avenue was known to host high-class sex workers and their clients, and was also known to open its doors to married men and women who wanted somewhere discreet to meet up and share an hour or 30 seconds. So exactly what Eula had been doing, visiting this house, frequenting this brothel, a lot, by the way, it's never actually been found out, but it's certainly an intriguing premise. There were rumors about who exactly Eula could have been hosting, including some higher-ups in Austin society. Was she some very high-class escort for the top dogs in Austin? We don't know, but things were getting shadier and shadier.
Yeah, definitely interesting. The prosecutors, they put forward the idea that Jimmy had learned of Eula's indiscretions, and after a night of heavy drinking, had confronted her. So they proposed that Eula had taken the axe to bed with her in order to defend herself should Jimmy become violent. Only, Jimmy had taken the axe and attacked his wife, but then Eula at some point had managed to wrestle the axe back and wound Jimmy. He then fought to get the axe back and use it to finish her off. When he'd realised the scene in front of him, he dragged her out to the alley, out the back, and just got back into bed, knowing the scene would look enough like the recent murders of the black women to get him off the hook. It was definitely a stretch, but it was actually a fairly convincing one. Luckily for Phillips, his father was a man of means, and he'd hired his son a strong legal defence team composed of William Walton and John Hancock, two superstars in the legal world.
Yeah, the defense for James Phillips, Jimmy Phillips, well, they argued that not only had their client known nothing of the extramarital affairs of his young wife, going to the house of assignation, therefore rendering the motive invalid, but there was even more solid indication of someone else being present in the house that evening. The bloody footprint they had found, of course. In a spectacular move, the defense, Walter and Hancock, had the bloody floorboard taken from the Phillipses' porch, presented before the jury, and Walton and Hancock had their client, Jimmy, remove his footwear to show the jury that the print wasn't anywhere close to Phillips's own footprint. Basically, it was like in O.J. Simpson trial when he...
The glove doesn't fit.
Yeah, the gloves doesn't fit. The footprint doesn't fit, so it couldn't have been him. Couldn't have been the husband. Phillips's feet were much smaller than the print that was on the board. The prosecution countered that because James Phillips would have been carrying his wife's dead body, the extra weight would have caused his feet to flatten out and fulfill the print. So therefore, in a brilliant move, the defense, one of the defense counsel, Walton, he had James Phillips pick him up and step on the board again. He's just carrying his attorney in the middle of the courtroom, proving that it made no discernible difference to the print his feet produced. That should have been really amounted to enough to be considered reasonable doubt, but the desperation to tie a bow around the whole Annihilator matter was greater than the defense could have foreseen. James Phillips was ultimately found guilty of the murder of his wife Eula Phillips and sentenced to 7 years. The interest in the case throughout the trial was massive thanks to the profile of the killings and had become a sensation in not only Austin, but Texas too. As for Moses Hancock, that one ended in a hung jury after Moses' teenage daughter came forward with testimony that her mother had never actually been able to work up the courage to show her father the incriminating letter, making that motive entirely invalid. So, of all the murders of the servant girl Annihilator, you only have one conviction, and that was the husband who did it.
Yes, yeah.
They had nothing for any of the other murders at all. They were totally up shit creek. And even the one conviction they did have was flimsy at best.
Yeah, and I feel like they were still giving themselves a pat on the back. Like, we did it. Case
Another
closed.
job well done. But that takes us to February 12th, 1886, when there was a very unusual incident. On that day, police officer John Bracken was fetched to a small Masontown saloon, where he met the saloon keeper, Dick Rogers, and his neighbour, Clabe Hawkins. When Officer Bracken arrived, there was already an almighty commotion going on, and a large group had gathered at the saloon. At the source of the tensions was a 19-year-old cook named Nathan Elgin. Nathan was African-American, born in 1866, the fourth of 5 kids. He was originally from Arkansas, moved to Austin when the Civil War ended, He was likely a servant for most of his life, and seemed like an unremarkable fellow, though he did have a couple of run-ins with the law. In 1881, 4 years before the servant girl Annihilator struck, he was arrested for carrying a pistol and getting into an argument with another young man. The following year, he was arrested again for sending a threatening letter to the deputy sheriff. Now, this day in February 1886, Elgin had been drinking in the saloon when he had suddenly flown into a furious rage and had begun beating the holy hell out of a young girl he was there with, a girl by the name of Julia. He then had dragged the girl from the saloon to a nearby house where she could be heard screaming from inside. Fearing that Nathan Elgin might actually kill the young girl, the saloon owner, Dick Rogers, had called for the police. Once Officer Bracken had the situation broken down for him, Officer Bracken, Dick Rogers, and Clabe Hawkins entered the house and managed to pull Nathan off the girl and out of the house. Nathan put up a fight and wrestled with Dick Rogers and Clabe Hawkins, but when Officer Bracken attempted to handcuff Elgin, Elgin broke free and knocked Officer Bracken to the ground. In a very stupid move, Nathan Elgin pulled a knife, at which point Officer Bracken pulled his service revolver and fired a shot. The single bullet was enough to put Nathan Elgin on the ground and knock the fight right out of him. The shot, though not immediately, would prove fatal. In fact, the single round had shattered Nathan's spine and left him paralyzed until he succumbed to the wound the very next day. Now, Keith, I hear you barking, big dog. I can hear you wondering. You're looking at me with a very shocked face. Why would I suddenly be talking about some madman getting drunk at a bar, beating up a woman, dragging her into a house next door?
It's a good story, Mike, but why?
Yeah, well, that's because, along with the information about being paralyzed by Officer Bracken's bullet, the autopsy of Nathan Elgin also revealed something very interesting. Nathan Elgin was missing a toe. Shock. Horror. While the Nathan Elgin discovery had come far too late for authorities to be able to take advantage and prosecute the man, he is dead, it wasn't too late for the defense teams of both Moses Hancock and James Phillips. Both men's lawyers were able to use the very incriminating evidence against Nathan Elgin to throw further doubt on the charges against their clients. The Nathan Elgin evidence had been introduced at James Phillips' trial, though only briefly and unconvincingly to say the least. A plaster cast of Nathan's toe was taken by William von Rosenberg, the same man who took the floorboard against which it would be compared. When the cast was compared to the bloody print on the board, taken from Eula Phillips' murder, a match couldn't be ruled out, nor could it be confirmed with any certainty. It may not have been enough to put reasonable doubt into the minds of the jury at the original trial, but 6 months later, James Phillips would get a huge reprieve when the Court of Appeals heard the case. This time around, the panel of judges ruled that there seemed to be a serious lack of any actual evidence that he had killed his wife, and what there was either hearsay or circumstantial. They ultimately ordered a retrial, but none would ever materialize. More than likely, the news of Nathan Elgin, this all became public, and with tensions being quelled, there was no longer any need to chase the prosecutions against Moses Hancock or James Phillips, who nobody ever really believed they'd killed their wives anyway. As far as the public was concerned, the killer was dead, and that was good enough for authorities.
There were other accounts from the night when Elgin was shot, which cast doubt on the idea that he was the killer. So some claimed that the girl Julia never existed at all, and said that the woman Elgin was dragging from the saloon was actually his wife, Sally, and she'd gotten drunk and was making a bit of a scene, so he was getting her out of there. When Officer Bracken showed up to make the arrest, locals tried to protect Elgin, partly because of the rising tensions between the black community and the police. But Bracken shot him in the back anyway, and after that, well, things got a bit murky. Some say that the police made up the story, the cover for Bracken, and while they're at it, they also decided to pin the servant girl murders on him as well.
They chopped off one of his toes.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, like it all seemed very convenient, especially with the whole with the four toe thing. But that could have been added to the story after, or because he'd been paralyzed, they could have just snipped the toe off. He wouldn't have even known.
Yeah.
But I guess we'll never really know the truth. But I will say that after Elgin died, the murder stopped completely.
Yeah, I know it is a bit convenient that you'll never hear of the person who a lot of people believed is the servant girl Annihilator. He could never defend himself.
You'll never see his day in court. Yeah.
So both Moses Hancock and Jimmy James Phillips, they left town after being released. James Phillips would suffer headaches for the rest of his life, caused by the axe wound he suffered. He remarried and died in 1929, aged 68. Now, regarding Nathan Elgin, as Keith said, after his death, the murders did stop. And so he is a pretty interesting shout. I mean, you said why it couldn't be him.
Yeah.
This is why it could be him.
Yeah.
He's honestly, a lot of people think, the best reason we have, or the best suspect we have for who was actually the servant girl Annihilator. He lived in Austin, Texas for the majority of his life. After moving from Arkansas, he knew it well, and being a servant, he may well have been mistreated by other servants and bosses, ladies of the house, which may have led to him having violent tendencies towards women. He started off killing other servants before he moved up to the wealthier women.
Yeah.
He also had a history of violence, sending threatening letters and getting into arguments that were so bad the cops had to be called. And when the suspect was seen fleeing the scene, which was seen a couple of times, it was always in the direction of Nathan's home. And of course, there's the print that helps too. And the night when 2 women were killed, Christmas Eve, when Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips were killed, Nathan Elgin's wife Sally happened to be giving birth to a child that very day. Maybe he found his wife giving birth, stressful, so he needed to blow off some steam. That's why he murdered 2 women in the same night. It's possible. And it's amazing how quickly these murders seemingly were forgotten. I actually didn't really know anything about these at all. But the funny thing is that 3 years later, a certain Mr. Ripper were to go off on his own murder spree in the far-off land of distant London. Maybe that's why he never struck again. Off the queue in London, innit?
Oh, bloody hell.
Maybe he did. Maybe he left the shores of Austin, Texas and went to Victorian London and struck again. Saucy Jack was on the loose.
Saucy Jack. I have to say, I like the Jack the Ripper theory.
Yeah?
So the strongest suspect linking the 2 sets of crimes is a Malay cook known as Maurice, who was living in Austin in 1885. So he worked at a small hotel called the Pearl House, just blocks away from where Susan Hancock, Mary Ramey, and Eliza Shelley were murdered.
Okay.
So Maurice, he left Austin in January of 1886, shortly after the killings of Susan Hancock and Eula Phillips.
Okay.
And according to some reports, he was in London around the time of the Whitechapel murders.
Ooh, he connects them.
Right, yeah. So maybe he started scratching a niche in Austin, targeting poor black servant girls because they were easy prey. And maybe knowing that he'd be leaving town soon, he decided to take a risk and turn his rage on white women like Susan and Eula on that horrific Christmas Eve of 1885. And if the testimony of Jimmy Phillips' trial is to be believed, Eula may have been doing some sex work on the side, something that would later become the hallmark of Jack the Ripper's victims.
Very good.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So
Isn't
he
it?
starts off with servants, then goes after their employers, then goes after sex workers.
Yes. Yeah. I like that theory.
That's a good one. That's a fun one. Well, the Jack the Ripper theories are always so much fun.
It's the gift that keeps giving.
It is. It truly is. All right, folks. Thank you so much for listening to this whole episode of the That Chapter podcast. Hope you enjoyed our retelling of the Servant Girl Annihilator. Thanks for listening. As always, please, tell your friends, rate and review. Or else. Just know that, folks. Or else. We like to threaten our listeners and say we don't ask, we threaten.
Yeah, it's the only way to do it. The next step is we're coming to your house.
Exactly. That's me cocking a gun. Let the record show. All right.
He is in the army, people.
Exactly. I am a tier 1 operator. I have the uniform to prove it. All right, folks. Thanks so much for listening.
I'll see you.
Bye.